Hello, we are Group 55, and for our qualitative research, we selected Starbucks, a global coffeehouse chain. Starbucks goes by the mission to inspire and nurture the human spirit, one person, one cup, and one neighborhood at a time. We interviewed 4 Starbucks baristas, and in this presentation, we will go over the open, axial, and selective codes that we generated. We'll end with a reflection on our research question. Using a grounded theory method, we believe that with every interview we do, we get new insights and perspectives about the theories we drew from the previous ones. Every interviewee brings something new to the table. However, at the same time, it is also essential to see a pattern and develop a leading theme. After the first and second interview, we could see that certain topics were repeated. For example, a recurring theme of monetary incentive as being the primary focus was mentioned. Workplace stress vis-a-vis dealing with customers was also mentioned. And after the 2 final interviews, we could confirm this pattern. Moreover, after coding all the interviews, we were able to reject some theories or hypotheses we had before. A major example of development in our coding scheme was how, prior to the interview, we thought we would only be using internal and external motivations as a code. On the contrary, the interviews revealed that the interviewees sometimes interpreted definitions differently and also quite unintentionally paid a lot of attention to pro-social motivation. So we adjusted our codes to match not only intrinsic and extrinsic but also pro-social motivation. We also tried to link them to each other.
Now let's move on to the memos. There are 3 types of memos in qualitative research: observational, theoretical, and methodological. Observational memos are also known as field notes, describing what the researcher noticed in the field. They are supposed to be reliably represent what happened. A few examples of our observational memos are: the interviewee laughed while answering the question whether they believe pro-social motivation applies to them, and the interviewee grimaced while mentioning an uncomfortable situation with a customer. Moving on to the theoretical memos, they are a link between what has happened in reality and how the researcher experienced and interpreted it. The researcher's task in creating theoretical memos is to hypothesize, develop new ideas, and link them together when it seems required. The examples from our interviewees are: seeing that she enjoys making the drinks because she is able to interact with the customers. It is clear that she enjoys the interaction and that it is a big part of her motivation in work, and the interviewee does not seem to have that much positive energy towards their activities at work. While naming them, it feels like it is kind of a boring sequence for them. Finally, methodological memos can be summarized as a note, reminder, critique, or an instruction from researcher to researcher related to the tactics and methods of their investigation. It usually describes what the researcher has done or planned for future methodological processes basing on the previous operational acts. The examples are: interviewee seems to state that interaction with customers is an external factor, while we interviewees decided to define such activities that spark a type of emotion in interviewees as an internal motivation/lack of motivation. May need to define more clearly in the beginning in upcoming interviews what we will be defining as internal and external motivation for the sake of miscommunication. And finally, I explained the concept of pro-social motivation before asking the interviewee whether they identify with it in order to make sure they understand the concept.
In order to come up with a selective coding for each of the interviews, we first grouped open codes that were related to a common concept or reflected the attitude of the interviewee towards a specific type of motivation. For instance, from one of the first interviews, those open codes were: money is a basis for working, money is a need, not a motivation, and monetary needs fulfillment. Using these open codes, we came up with an axial code that would explain the idea present in all of them. This axial code is external motivation as a basis of interviewee's work. Following this, we need to come up with a selective code that would transform this theme stated by the axial code into something that would be useful for answering our research question, and that would help us build and/or extend our theory regarding our investigation. In this example from the axial code, external motivation as a basis of interviewee's work, we decided to extract a following selective code. Basis of motivation. For our research, it means that we treat extrinsic motivation in the form of monetary incentives as a basis for the whole motivation of the employee. We believe that without its presence, it would be impossible, or at least a lot harder for the employee, to be affected and act upon the internal motivating factors.
The research question that we first decided to take was the following. To what extent can intrinsic motivation substitute for extrinsic motivation in the Starbucks employees? We believe that with this question and the interviews, we would be able to determine the extent to which employees are more motivated by intrinsic factors such as emotions of success or happiness over the obvious extrinsic factor, the payment. However, after conducting 2 separate interviews, we noticed that our respondents understood some terms differently than we interviewers had expected, and the field of intrinsic motivation had grown from the initial boundaries we stated to more specified parts such as pro-social motivation and intrinsic in service of extrinsic motivations. Therefore, after the 2 interviews, we decided to arrange the research question to be more compatible with the visible trend in answers. From the extent intrinsic motivation can substitute extrinsic motivation to the extent extrinsic motivation works as a basis for other motivation factors. After the adjustment, we needed to explore more on the theoretical framework, reading into different articles on the different intrinsic motivations that were introduced. Because the basis for the question had not changed that much, our theoretical framework was validated once the additional theories had been added into.